The needle trembled in Betty Collins's weathered hands as she pressed it through the coarse fabric, each stitch a desperate prayer against the howling wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. Outside, the Montana winter raged with the fury of a wounded beast, but inside, the warmth of the fire cast dancing shadows across her work. She had been stitching for 3 days straight, her fingers raw and bleeding, creating something beautiful from the scraps of her former life. "I'm ugly, sir," she had whispered to the mountain man who found her half frozen in the snow, her face scarred by the fire that had taken everything she once knew. "But I can sew." Paul Campbell had looked at her then with eyes like storm clouds, his massive frame filling the doorway of his isolated cabin. Snow clung to his dark beard, and his hands were stained with the blood of the deer he had been tracking. He was a man carved from the very mountains themselves, rough and unyielding, yet something in his gaze had softened when he saw her broken form huddled against his door. "Then stitch your name to mine," he had said, his voice as deep as the canyon winds. And Betty had thought she was dreaming, delirious from cold and hunger and the weight of her shame. But that had been 3 months ago, and now, as she worked by the firelight, she understood what he had meant. Not marriage, not in the way the world understood it, but something deeper. A partnership forged in necessity, tempered by survival, and strengthened by the quiet understanding that sometimes broken things could be mended together into something stronger than they had ever been apart. The storm outside seemed to sense her thoughts, pressing harder against the walls as if trying to tear apart this fragile sanctuary they had built together. Betty's scarred fingers moved with practiced precision, creating tiny, perfect stitches that would hold against any force. She had learned long ago that the most beautiful things often came from the most broken places, and her needlework was proof of that truth. A heavy footstep on the birch made her look up from her sewing. Paul was returning from checking the animals, and she could hear him stomping the snow from his boots before he entered. The door opened with a gust of frigid air that made the fire dance and flicker, and then he was there, filling the space with his presence, ice crystals melting in his beard. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice carrying the weight of concern. "Could last another week, maybe more." Betty nodded, setting down her needle. She had grown to read the subtle changes in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when he was worried, the slight furrow between his brows when he was calculating their chances. They had enough food to last, enough wood for the fire, but storms like this could bring other dangers. Desperate men, hungry animals, the kind of trouble that found its way to isolated cabins when the world turned white and merciless. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The memory of how she had come to be here still haunted her dreams. Betty had been traveling west with a wagon train, seeking a new life after the fire that had claimed her family's farm and left her face marked with scars that made children stare and women whisper. She had been the seamstress for the group, mending clothes and creating new garments from whatever fabric could be spared. Her skill with a needle was legendary, but her appearance made her an outcast even among outcasts. When the wagon train had been attacked by raiders seeking supplies for the harsh winter ahead, Betty had been left behind, considered too ugly to take and too weak to pose a threat. She had wandered through the snow for days, living on berries and stream water, her hands growing numb and her hope fading with each step. It was Paul who had found her, collapsed against a fallen tree, her lips blue with cold, and her scarred face peaceful in what she thought was death. He had carried her to his cabin without a word, tended her frostbite with gentle hands that seemed too large for such delicate work, and fed her soup made from venison and wild herbs. For days she had drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of the man who had saved her life. When she had finally been strong enough to speak, to explain who she was and where she had come from, Paul had listened without judgment. His own face bore scars, she noticed, though his were hidden beneath his beard. A long white line ran from his left ear to his jaw, and his hands showed the marks of a life lived hard in the wilderness. "I'm ugly, sir," she had whispered, touching the raised skin on her cheek where the flames had kissed her. "But I can sew." It was all she had to offer, and all she thought she was worth. Her beauty was gone, her family was dead, her possessions lost to the fire and the raiders. But her hands still worked, Her eyes could still see the tiny stitches needed to hold fabric together, and her mind still held the patterns passed down from her mother and grandmother before her. Paul had looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. But then he had spoken those words that changed everything. Then stitch your name to mine. She had thought he was mocking her at first, making cruel jest of her offer. But as the days passed and she recovered her strength, she began to understand. He lived alone in this mountain cabin, trapping and hunting, trading furs in the distant town when the weather allowed. His clothes were practical but rough, mended with clumsy stitches that spoke of a man who had learned to do everything for himself. His cabin was clean but sparse, lacking the small comforts that a woman's touch could provide. And he was lonely. She could see it in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the careful distance he maintained, in the way he seemed surprised when she spoke to him directly. He was a man who had forgotten how to live with another person, but who remembered enough to want it. So she had begun to sew. First, she mended his clothes, replacing his rough patches with neat, nearly invisible repairs. Then she hemmed new shirts from fabric he brought back from town, creating garments that fit his large frame properly instead of hanging loose or pulling tight. She made curtains for the windows, cushions for the hard wooden chairs, a quilt for the bed that was large enough to cover his long legs. Each stitch was a small act of gratitude, a way of paying him back for saving her life. But as the weeks passed, she realized it was becoming something more. She was making this place into a home, and he was letting her. More than that, he was helping her, bringing her the finest fabrics he could find in town, asking her opinion on colors and patterns, watching with quiet fascination as her scarred hands created beauty from simple cloth. The wind howled louder, and Betty could hear something banging against the side of the cabin. Paul moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain she had made from blue calico to peer out into the storm. "Tree branch it," he said. "Big one. I'll need to clear it before it damages the roof." Betty set aside her sewing and stood, moving to help him with his coat. It was a ritual they had developed over the months, this careful dance of assistance. She would help him dress for the poem, and he would check that she had everything she needed before he left. Neither of them spoke of it as anything more than practical necessity, but Betty felt the weight of intimacy in these small gestures. "Be careful," she said, as she always did, and he nodded, as he always did, before stepping back into the storm. Alone again, Betty returned to her sewing, but her mind was not on the stitches. She was thinking about the conversation they had shared the night before, when Paul had returned from town with news that made her hands shake. "Raiders hit the Andersons' place," he had said, his voice grim. "Burned them out, took everything they could carry. Family's gone to stay with relatives in Colorado, what's left of them. The Andersons lived 20 miles south, close enough that their smoke would be visible on a clear day. If the raiders were moving north, following the mountain passes where isolated homesteads made easy targets, Paul's cabin would be next. They both knew it, though neither had spoken the words aloud. "How many?" Betty had asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Tom Anderson said 8, maybe 10. Well-armed, well-organized, not just desperate men looking for food. These ones knew what they were doing. Betty had nodded, understanding the implications. These weren't random attacks born of winter desperation. This was something planned, systematic, the kind of raid that left no witnesses and no survivors. "We could leave," she had suggested quietly. "Head to town until they move on." Paul had shaken his head. "Storm's too bad for travel, and it's 40 miles to town through mountain passes. We'd freeze to death before we made it halfway. Besides," he had added, his voice taking on a harder edge, "this is my home. I won't be driven out by thieves and murderers." Betty had understood his position, even admired it, but fear still coiled in her stomach like a living thing. She had survived one attack already, had seen what desperate men could do when they believed no one would stop them. The scars on her face were proof enough of that. Now, as she sewed by the firelight and listened to Paul clearing the fallen branch from outside, she tried to push those thoughts away. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when there was work to be done. Her hands moved steadily, creating the intricate pattern she had been working on for weeks. It was a wedding quilt, though she had never admitted that to herself or to Paul. The design was traditional, a double wedding ring pattern that her grandmother had taught her, but the colors were her own choice. Deep blues like Paul's eyes when he was thinking, warm browns like the wood of his cabin, gold like the firelight that danced between them in the evenings. Each ring in the pattern represented a promise, a hope, a dream of what might be possible between two broken people who had found something worth protecting in each other. Betty knew it was foolish to hope for more than what they had, but her hands seemed to have their own wisdom, creating beauty and meaning even when her mind tried to deny it. The door opened again, bringing another gust of cold air and the sound of Paul stamping snow from his boots. This time, though, his expression was different. Alert. Tense. The kind of look he got when he was tracking dangerous game. "What is it?" Betty asked, setting down her needle. Paul moved to the rifle rack near the door, checking the loads in his weapons with practiced efficiency. Saw lights through the trees. Moving this way, maybe 2 miles out. Could be travelers looking for shelter, but probably not, Betty finished, her mouth going dry. Probably not, Paul agreed. He handed her a smaller rifle, one he had been teaching her to use over the past month. "Remember what I taught you. Don't aim where they are. Aim where they're getting, and don't shoot unless you're sure you can hit what you're aiming at." Betty took the weapon with hands that were steadier than she felt. The weight of it was familiar now, though she prayed she would never have to use it for anything more than hunting rabbits. But she had learned long ago that prayers weren't always answered the way you wanted them to be. Paul moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, extinguishing all but one lamp and positioning furniture to create barriers near the windows. Betty watched him work, marveling at how quickly he could transform their peaceful home into a fortress. This was the other side of the man who had saved her, the part that had allowed him to survive alone in the wilderness for years. He was gentle with her, patient with her fears and limitations. But he was also a predator when he needed to be, capable of violence when violence was the only answer. "How long do we have?" she asked, checking her own rifle the way he had taught her. "Hour, maybe less if they're pushing hard through the snow." Paul paused in his preparations to look at her, his expression softer than it had been moments before. "Betty, if something happens to me, if they get past me somehow, you take that rifle and you run. There's a cave about half a mile north, hidden behind the waterfall. You can wait there until they're gone." "I'm not leaving you," Betty said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "You are if I tell you to," Paul replied, but there was no anger in his words, only concern. "You've been through enough. You don't need to go through this too." Betty set down her rifle and moved to where he stood near the window. In the lamplight, his scars were more visible, and she could see the weight of old battles in his eyes. This man had saved her life, had given her a home when she had nothing, had treated her with kindness when the world had shown her only cruelty. She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, feeling the raised skin beneath her fingertips. "I'm ugly, sir," she said, repeating the words she had spoken months ago. "But I can sew." Paul's hand covered hers, warm and rough and gentle. "You're not ugly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The words hung between them like a bridge across a chasm, connecting two souls who had been isolated for too long. Betty felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for tears later, if they survived what was coming. "Then let me stitch my name to yours," she said, using his own words from that first day. "Let me stay and fight beside you." Paul studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her determination against his desire to protect her. Finally, he nodded, though reluctance was clear in his expression. "Stay low, stay behind cover, and don't take unnecessary risks," he said. "These men won't show mercy to a woman, especially not one who's fighting back." Betty nodded, understanding the implications. She had seen what raiders did to women, had heard the stories whispered around wagon train campfires. Death would be a mercy compared to what they might have planned for her. The lights Paul had spotted were closer now, visible through the storm as they moved between the trees. Betty counted at least 6 separate sources, which meant 6 men or more. The odds weren't good, but they had advantages too. They knew the terrain, they had good cover, and they were fighting for something worth protecting. "Remember," Paul said, his voice low and calm, "they have to come to us. They're cold, tired, probably hungry. They'll want to end this quick, get inside where it's warm. That makes them predictable. Betty nodded, settling into position behind an overturned table near the back window. From here, she could cover the rear approach while Paul watched the front. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, steadily, the way Paul had taught her on. The wind was dying down, she realized, which was both good and bad. Good because it would be easier to hear the raiders approaching, bad because it would also be easier for them to coordinate their attack. The sudden quiet felt ominous, as if the storm itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The wind that had been howling for hours suddenly dropped to a whisper, and in that unnatural quiet, Betty could hear the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Multiple sets of feet, moving with the careful precision of men who knew how to hunt other men. Paul had positioned himself near the front window, his rifle resting on the windowsill, his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Betty could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had slowed and deepened. This was a man preparing for war. "I see them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. 4 coming up the main path, 2 more circling around to the back. They know what they're doing. Betty adjusted her position, making sure she had a clear view of the rear approach. Her hands were steady on the rifle, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure the raiders would hear it. She thought of the quilt she had been working on, the careful stitches that represented hopes and dreams, and wondered if she would ever finish it. The first shot shattered the quiet like breaking glass. Paul's rifle spoke, and through the front window, Betty saw one of the raiders spin and fall into the snow. The others scattered, seeking cover behind trees and rocks, their shouts echoing through the forest. "Betty, back window," Paul called, and she turned to see 2 figures emerging from the trees behind the cabin. They were moving fast, using the cover of the storm to mask their approach, but not fast enough. Betty took careful aim, remembering Paul's lessons about leading a moving target, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and one of the raiders stumbled, clutching his leg. Not a killing shot, but enough to slow him down. His companion raised his own weapon, and Betty ducked as the window above her head exploded in a shower of glass and wood splinters. "Good shot," Paul called, his voice tight with concentration. "Keep them back there. Don't let them get close to the cabin." More shots rang out from the front, and Betty could hear Paul working the bolt of his rifle with mechanical precision. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, the work of a man who had learned to make every bullet count. But there were more raiders than they had ammunition, and Betty knew this fight couldn't last forever. The wounded raider behind the cabin was still moving, dragging himself toward better cover, while his companion laid down covering fire. Betty waited for her moment, then rose and fired again, this time aiming for center mass. The man dropped and didn't get up. "One down back here," she called to Paul, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "2 down front," Paul replied, "but they're regrouping." This isn't over. As if to prove his point, a new voice shouted from the trees, harsh and commanding. "You in the cabin, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and we'll make it quick." Paul's response was another rifle shot that sent bark flying from the tree where the voice had come from. The message was clear enough. "Have it your way," the voice shouted back. "Boys, burn them out." Betty's blood turned to ice. Fire was her greatest fear, the nightmare that had haunted her dreams since the night her family's farm had burned. The scars on her face seemed to throb with remembered pain, and for a moment she was paralyzed by the memory of flames and smoke and screaming. "Betty!" Paul's voice cut through her panic. "They're moving. 2 coming up the sides, trying to get close enough to throw torches." She shook her head, forcing herself back to the present. This wasn't the past, and she wasn't the helpless girl who had watched her world burn. She was a woman with a rifle and the skill to use it, fighting beside a man who had given her a reason to live. The raiders were getting bolder, using the cover of darkness and falling snow to move closer to the cabin. Betty could see one of them creeping along the side wall, a burning torch in his hand, and she knew they were running out of time. Once the cabin caught fire, they would have to choose between burning alive and facing the raiders in the open. She took careful aim at the man with the torch, leading him slightly as Paul had taught her. The shot took him in the chest, and he fell backward into the snow, the torch hissing as it was extinguished in the white powder. But even as she celebrated the small victory, she could see another raider moving up the opposite side of the cabin. "Paul, left side," she called. But he was already in motion, swinging his rifle around to cover the new threat. His shot went wide, and the raider dove for cover behind a woodpile just 20 feet from the cabin wall. "Too close," Paul muttered, working the bullet of his rifle. "We need to end this before they get lucky with those torches." Betty understood what he meant. They could hold the raiders off for a while, but eventually their ammunition would run out, or one of the torches would find its mark. They needed to break the siege, to force the raiders to retreat or die trying. "How many are left?" she asked, reloading her rifle with practiced movements. "3, maybe 4, Paul replied. "But they're the smart ones, the ones who've survived this long by being careful. They won't make it easy." As if to prove his point, the remaining raiders began a coordinated assault. 2 of them opened fire from the front, forcing Paul to keep his head down, while a third tried to circle around to Betty's position. She could hear him moving through the snow, trying to use the sound of gunfire to mask his approach. Betty waited, controlling her breathing, watching for any sign of movement in the darkness beyond the broken window. When the raider finally appeared, silhouetted against the white snow, she was ready. Her shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the darkness. But the wounded raider wasn't finished. Even as he fell, he was reaching for something at his belt, and Betty realized with horror that it was another torch, already lit and ready to throw. She worked the bolt of her rifle frantically, but she knew she wouldn't be fast enough. The torch arced through the air, trailing sparks and smoke, heading directly for the cabin's wooden wall. Betty watched in fascination and terror as it tumbled end over end, knowing that in seconds, their sanctuary would become their tomb. Then Paul was there, moving faster than she had ever seen him move, diving through the broken front window and rolling in the snow. He came up with the torch in his hands, and instead of trying to extinguish it, he hurled it back toward the trees where the remaining raiders were hiding. The improvised weapon landed in a pile of dry brush, and within moments, the undergrowth was ablaze. The raiders, caught between the spreading fire and the cabin's defenders, found themselves with nowhere to hide. One of them broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. The other stood his ground, raising his rifle for one last desperate shot. Paul was faster. His rifle spoke, and the final raider crumpled to the ground, his weapon unfired. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the burning brush and the whisper of falling snow. Betty remained at her post, rifle ready, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But gradually she began to accept that it was over. They had survived. Paul climbed all the way back through the broken window, snow melting in his beard, his eyes still alert for danger. But when he looked at Betty, his expression softened, and she could see the relief and pride in his gaze. "You did good," he said, setting his rifle aside and moving to check her for injuries. "Real good. I couldn't have held them off alone." Betty felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She had fought, had killed to protect what she cared about, and she had not broken. The scared, scarred woman who had begged for shelter months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who could stand beside Paul Campbell as an equal. "We should check the bodies," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Make sure they're all dead, see if there are any others we missed." Paul nodded, but first he moved to the window and called out into the darkness. "Anyone else out there, you'd better run. Next ones won't get a warning shot." The forest remained silent except for the hiss and pop of the burning brush. After a few minutes, Paul took up his rifle and moved toward the door. "Stay here," he said. "Keep watch while I check the perimeter. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you know what to do." Betty nodded, understanding. If Paul didn't return, she was to take what supplies she could carry and head for the hidden cave he had told her about. It was a grim contingency, but a necessary one. In this wilderness, survival often came down to hard choices and harder truths. She watched from the window as Paul moved through the snow, checking each fallen raider with professional thoroughness. He moved like a hunter, alert and careful, never assuming that a downed enemy was truly harmless. It was a side of him she had glimpsed before, but never seen so clearly. The part that had allowed him to survive alone in the mountains for years. The raider she had wounded was still alive, though barely. Paul knelt beside him, and Betty could see them talking, though she couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, Paul stood and walked back toward the cabin, his expression grim. "What did he say?" Betty asked as Paul came back inside. "Said there were 8 of them originally. We got 6. One ran off and he's dying. But he also said this wasn't random. They were told about this place, told there was a woman here worth taking and supplies worth stealing." Betty felt ice form in her stomach. "Told by who?" "Wouldn't say, but I can guess. Someone in town, someone who knew about you, knew you were here with me, someone who thought a scarred woman wouldn't be missed if she disappeared." The implications were clear and terrifying. This wasn't over. Whoever had sent the raiders would send more when these ones failed to return. Their sanctuary had been compromised, their secret revealed. They would have to leave, find somewhere new, start over again. But as Betty looked around the cabin at the curtains she had sewn, the quilt she had made, the small touches that had transformed this place into a home, she felt a fierce surge of anger. She had found something here worth protecting, something worth fighting for. She would not be driven away by cowards who struck from the shadows. "We can't run," she said, voicing the thought that was forming in her mind. "If we run now, we'll be running forever. There will always be someone else, someone who thinks we're easy targets because we're different, because we don't fit into their idea of what people should be." Paul studied her face, and she could see him weighing her words against the practical realities of their situation. "You're talking about going to town," he said, "confronting whoever sent them." "I'm talking about finishing this," Betty replied, "about making sure they understand that we're not victims anymore." The decision to go to town was not made lightly. They spent the rest of the night preparing, gathering supplies and weapons, planning their approach. Paul knew the town well, knew which men could be trusted, and which ones would sell their own mothers for the right price. Betty had only been there once when Paul had taken her to buy fabric, but she remembered the stares, the whispers, the way people had looked at her scars and turned away. "It won't be easy," Paul warned as they loaded his horse in the pack mule. "Town folk don't like outsiders, especially ones who make them uncomfortable. And if someone there is working with raiders, they'll have friends, people who will stand by them no matter what we say." Betty adjusted the pack on the mule, making sure the weight was distributed evenly. "Then we'll have to make them listen," she said. "We'll have to show them what happens when they send killers after innocent people." The ride to town took most of the day, following mountain paths that Paul knew like the back of his hand. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was bitter, cutting through their heavy coats like knives. Betty rode behind Paul on his horse, her arms around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his body against the cold. As they traveled, she found herself thinking about the quilt she had left behind. The wedding ring pattern that represented hopes and dreams she had barely dared to acknowledge. It seemed like a symbol of everything she was fighting for. The possibility of a future built on something more than mere survival. The town of Cedar Falls appeared in the valley below them as the sun was beginning to set, its lights twinkling like fallen stars in the gathering darkness. It was larger than Betty remembered, with perhaps 200 souls calling it home. There was a main street lined with shops and businesses, a church with a tall steeple, and dozens of houses scattered across the hillsides. "Where do we start?" Betty asked as they rode down the main street, drawing stares from the few people brave enough to be out in the cold. "Saloon," Paul replied. "If there's information to be had, that's where we'll find it. But stay close and keep your rifle handy. If this goes bad, it'll go bad fast." The Broken Wheel Saloon was exactly what Betty had expected, a rough establishment that catered to miners, trappers, and other men who lived hard lives in a hard land. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, and conversations died as they entered, every eye turning to study the mountain man and his scarred companion. Paul approached the bar with the confidence of a man who belonged, ordering whiskey for himself and coffee for Betty. The bartender, a thin man with nervous eyes, served them without comment, but Betty could feel the tension in the room, the way conversations resumed in hushed tones. "Looking for information," Paul said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the bartender's ears. About some men who might have been through here recently. 8 of them, well armed, asking questions about isolated homesteads. The bartender's eyes flickered nervously, and Betty saw him glance toward a table in the corner where 3 men sat playing cards. They were well dressed by frontier standards, their clothes too clean, their hands too soft. Town men, not wilderness dwellers. "Don't know nothing about that," the bartender said, but his voice lacked conviction. Paul laid a gold coin on the bar, more money than the bartender probably saw in a month. "Maybe this will help your memory," he said. The bartender stared at the gold coin as if it might bite him, then glanced again toward the corner table. One of the card players, a heavy-set man with a carefully waxed mustache, had stopped playing and was watching their conversation with obvious interest. "I said I don't know nothing," the bartender repeated, but his hand moved toward the coin despite his words. "That's a shame," Paul said, picking up the coin and preparing to leave. "Because whoever sent those men to attack my cabin made a big mistake. 6 of them are dead now, and I'm here to make sure the man who hired them joins them." The words carried clearly through the suddenly quiet saloon, and Betty saw several men reach for weapons. But Paul's reputation preceded him, and none of them seemed eager to be the first to draw iron against the mountain man who had just claimed to have killed 6 armed raiders. The heavy-set man at the corner table stood up slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Now hold on there, friend," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "No need for threats. We're all civilized people here." "Civilized people don't hire killers to attack women," Betty said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She had kept quiet until now, letting Paul take the lead, but something about the man's oily manner made her skin crawl. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, miss," the man replied, but his eyes were calculating, measuring distances and angles. "Though I have to say, it's unusual to see a woman in the broken wheel, especially one who's been in the wars, so to speak." The casual cruelty of the comment hit Betty like a physical blow, but instead of retreating, she felt her anger crystallize into something hard and sharp. This was the kind of man who would sell information about a scarred woman to raiders, who would think her life was worth less because she wasn't pretty enough to matter. "My name is Betty Collins," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the saloon. 3 months ago, I was left for dead by raiders who thought I wasn't worth taking. Today, I helped kill 6 men who came to finish the job. And tomorrow, I'm going to make sure that everyone who had a hand in sending them pays the price." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Betty could see the shock on faces around the room, the disbelief that a scarred woman would dare to speak so boldly in a place like this. But she could also see something else. Respect. These were men who understood violence, who recognized strength when they saw it, regardless of what package it came in. The heavy-set man's composure slipped slightly, and Betty caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath his smooth exterior. "That's quite a story, miss," he said, "but stories are all they are without proof, and dead men tell no tales." "True," Paul said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "But dying men sometimes do. The one we left alive back at the cabin was very talkative before he passed. Mentioned names, places, amounts of money. Interesting conversation." It was a bluff, but a good one. The dying raider had told them nothing useful before expiring in the snow, but the heavy-set man didn't know that. Betty watched his face carefully, looking for tells, for signs of guilt or fear. She found them. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture. This was the man, or at least one of them. The man who had sold information about her to killers, who had thought her life was worth whatever coin they had offered him. "You're Harold Morrison," she said, the name coming to her suddenly. She remembered Paul mentioning him before, a local businessman who dealt in information as much as legitimate trade. "You buy and sell secrets like other men buy and sell cattle." Morrison's mask slipped completely for just an instant, and Betty saw the truth in his eyes. Then he was smiling again, but it was the smile of a snake preparing to strike. "I think you've had too much to drink, miss," he said. "Perhaps you should go back to whatever hole you crawled out of before you say something you'll regret." The insult hung in the air like smoke, and Betty felt the familiar sting of shame that had haunted her since the fire. For a moment, she was tempted to retreat, to let Paul handle this confrontation while she faded into the background. It would be easier, safer, more in keeping with what the world expected from a scarred woman with nothing to offer but skill with a needle. But then she thought of the quilt waiting back at the cabin, of the careful stitches that represented hope and partnership, and the possibility of a life built on something more than mere survival. She thought of Paul's words, "Then stitch your name to mine," not as a servant or a charity case, but as an equal, a partner, someone worth standing beside. "The only thing I regret," she said, her voice steady and clear, "is not killing you myself when I had the chance." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but they felt right, felt true. She was done being ashamed of her scars, done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to discard her. She was Betty Collins, and she had survived fire and raiders and the worst that life could throw at her. She would not be intimidated by a soft man who dealt in other people's misery. Morrison's face darkened, and his hand moved toward his coat, but Paul was faster, his pistol clearing leather with practiced ease. The distinctive click of the hammer being cocked echoed through the silent saloon. "I wouldn't," Paul said, his voice calm but deadly. "Betty's right. You sold information about her to those raiders. Told them she was alone, defenseless, worth taking. You made her a target because you thought no one would care what happened to a scarred woman." "You can't prove anything," Morrison said, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Don't have to prove it in court," Paul replied. "This is frontier justice, and you know the rules. You sent killers after innocent people, and now you pay the price." Betty could see the other men in the saloon weighing their options, deciding whether to stand with Morrison or let frontier justice take its course. These were hard men who lived by hard rules, and the law of the mountains was clear. Those who preyed on the innocent forfeited their right to protection. "Wait," Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly. "Wait, let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out. Come to an arrangement." "The only arrangement," Betty said, stepping forward, "is that you leave town tonight and never come back. Take your friends with you and spread the word that Paul Campbell and Betty Collins are not to be bothered. Anyone who tries will end up like those raiders." Morrison's eyes darted around the room looking for support, for someone willing to stand with him. But the other patrons had made their choice, and it wasn't him. Even his card-playing companions had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man who hired raiders to attack women. "This isn't over," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't watch your backs forever." "Don't have to," Paul said. "Word will spread about what happened here tonight. Every raider, every outlaw, every piece of human garbage between here and California will know that we're not easy targets. They'll know that we fight back and we win." Morrison backed toward the door, his hands raised, his face pale with fear and humiliation. At the threshold, he turned back for one last look, and Betty could see the hatred in his eyes, the promise of future trouble. But she could also see something else: defeat. He was a broken man, his reputation destroyed, his network of informants and criminals is scattered. "Remember what I said," Betty called after him. "Anyone who comes after us ends up dead. Pass it on." The saloon remained quiet for several minutes after Morrison's departure, the weight of what had just transpired settling over the room like dust after an explosion. Then gradually conversations resumed, and the normal rhythm of frontier life reasserted itself. But Betty could feel the change, the way people looked at her now, not with pity or disgust, but with a kind of wary respect. Paul holstered his pistol and turned to the bartender, who was still staring at the gold coin on the bar. "That drink still available?" he asked. The bartender nodded quickly, pouring whiskey with hands that shook slightly. "On the house," he said, "both of you. Anyone who runs Harold Morrison out of town drinks free at the Broken Wheel." Betty accepted the offered drink, though she barely tasted it. Her mind was already turning to the future, to the journey back to the cabin and the life they were building there. Morrison was gone, but his words echoed in her memory. This isn't over. There would be other threats, other challenges, other people who thought a scarred woman and a mountain man were easy targets, but they would face those challenges together. as partners, as equals. Betty thought again of the quilt waiting at home, of the wedding ring pattern that represented promises and hopes and dreams. Maybe it was time to finish it, time to make those hopes real. "Ready to go home?" Paul asked, and the word home sent warmth through Betty's chest. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The ride back through the mountains was peaceful, the stars bright overhead and the snow crunching softly under their horses' hooves. Betty rode behind Paul again, her arms around his waist, but this time it felt different, not like a passenger seeking protection, but like a partner sharing a journey. "You did good back there," Paul said as they crested the ridge that looked down into their valley. "Real good. Morrison won't be sending any more raiders our way." "We did good," Betty corrected. "Both of us, together." Paul was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than usual. "Betty, what you said back there about stitching your name to mine. Did you mean it?" Betty's heart skipped a beat, but her voice was steady when she answered. "I meant it, if you'll have me, scars and all." "Scars and all," Paul agreed, and Betty could hear the smile in his voice. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cabin appeared ahead of them, warm light glowing from the windows Betty had repaired, smoke rising from the chimney into the star-filled sky. It looked like what it was, a home, a sanctuary, a place where two broken people had found something worth protecting. As they dismounted and began unloading their supplies, Betty caught sight of the quilt through the window, still spread across her sewing table where she had left it. The wedding ring pattern gleamed in the lamplight, each careful stitch a promise, a hope, a dream made real. "I have something to finish," she said, nodding toward the window. Paul followed her gaze and smiled, understanding immediately. "Then you'd better get to work," he said. "We've got a name to stitch to yours." Betty Collins, scarred but not broken, ugly by the world's standards but beautiful in the eyes that mattered, picked up her needle and began to sew. Each stitch was perfect, each ring in the pattern a symbol of the partnership they had forged in fire and blood and quiet understanding. She was no longer the frightened woman who had whispered, "I'm ugly, sir, but I can sew." She was someone stronger, someone who had found her place in the world and was ready to fight to keep it. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, two souls who had been broken by the world found healing in each other's company, stitching their names together with threads of courage, hope, and love. The quilt would be finished by morning, and with it, a new chapter in both their lives would begin.